So let's speak a little bit about the Boeing situation that's going on right now. Obviously, the 737 Max had
Yep.
tons of problems.
Yeah.
So, as you know, an industry insider, what's your take on that whole situation?
So obviously, it's a tragic situation. There's no way of looking at that problem where you don't think, man, there's just been all kinds of things that have just cascaded into a problem and then led to the loss of life, which is just something that the industry and everybody grieves about. I think the thing that we're seeing, and obviously we don't have firsthand knowledge, right? I think that's one of the things that when these events happen, you get a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking that happens.
Yeah.
But having been on the inside and watched a lot of different aircraft companies develop their airplanes, and particularly the safety groups and how they have worked in the last 10 years or so, they're really, really spending uber amounts of time trying to get the safety aspects right and looking at probabilities of components failures and looking at uh, obvious failure modes that can exist and how those can cascade into other problems. And I have a hard time when I see some of the newspaper articles or typically things you read from Seattle tend to be obviously kind of quasi pro Boeing, maybe you can say it that way, but I think you get a little more inside baseball from news up in Seattle, but it isn't like people are sleeping on the job. I don't think that happened. I think that everybody was trying to do their best to make this system safe, and you can criticize them after the fact about did they have enough sensors going in to make the system work properly. Obviously, if they had to do it over again, they'd have more sensors connected to the system, so it would have less chance of reacting. But I think there's also sort of that pilot interaction problem, which they assumed that if there was a problem with the system, that the pilots would respond. In this particular case, it's a horizontal stabilizer trim. Horizontal stabilizer trim makes the airplane go up and down and makes it fly so that you don't have a lot of control forces on the control stick. So you can move the horizontal stabilizer up and down. It's similar to the elevator, which is just behind it. So it makes the nose go up and down. And so if you can move the horizontal stabilizer up and down, it just makes the airplane fly a little bit smoother. And from automated systems, the automated systems tend to control the horizontal stabilizer, not the elevator. So when the MCAS system in this particular case decides that it's getting sensor input saying it's got to push the nose down, it starts driving the horizontal stabilizer to drive the nose down. That's no different than a lot of other failure modes that can happen. They can cause the same thing. Now, how they originate doesn't really matter at that point. If you have a horizontal stabilizer doing something that you don't like, the way that the 737 appears to be set up is there's a switch to turn it off. And in some cases, it seems like some pilots knew that and turned off the horizontal stabilizer so it couldn't do that. And so at that point, you're sort of flying the airplane by hand a little bit, or if you kicked on the autopilot, I think the autopilot would ignore the MCAS system and continue to fly the airplane. It just happened to be you got a pilot that reacted differently, that Boeing hadn't thought that they would react differently. And I think that's where the disconnect is that the safety people who've done analysis and looked at the probabilities of the chances it happened would be extremely remote. Um, they ran into a situation where they had a lot of sensors that had gone bad, and pilots didn't know how to necessarily react to the way the airplane was handling.
Mm.
That leads up to from a safety standpoint, to sort of an unknown outcome. And then that's where the problem lies, is that you've got so many people from different parts of the world flying airplanes, and you've got design groups that are thinking one thing, and pilots maybe thinking another. And that's where you're going to see a lot of the training things pop in, and that's where EASA and the FAA and the Transport Canada and a lot of the certifying organizations are starting to say, hey, maybe we need to go back and take a look at pilot training and get the pilots a little more up to date on some of this stuff. And that's that's probably a good move, whether they needed it or not at the beginning. I think if you'd asked anybody in the industry, they would say probably no. I mean, if a horizontal stabilizer starts to misbehave, turn it off. There's a switch right in the center console to turn the thing off.
Yeah.
And there's indicators down there that tell you it's moving. So it isn't like you don't know what's happening. You can clearly see what's happening. It's just how you respond to it. And I think that's where we in sort of the lightning area need to take that into consideration, because we also deal with systems and electronics that can misbehave, and if they do misbehave, we have to go look at what those consequences are. And in some instances, we assume that the pilot always makes the right move, that the pilot knows exactly what to go do every single time. And I don't think, and I think this 737 thing kind of proves it out, the pilots always know exactly what to do. So having less chaos in the cockpit is always a good thing, obviously,
Hmm.
right? So we are trying to push ourselves into less chaos, and things that we're doing, in my opinion, things we do on the lightning side should lead to less chaos. The airplane should still be flyable. It should be simple to get it into a flyable mode. We shouldn't have a lot of bells and warnings. And I think that's one of the things that's changing. I heard the other day where they're talking about the number of audio tones that are happening or interfering with the pilot's thought process. Yeah, if you're ever in a cockpit and you get anywhere near stall on some of these airplanes, the stick starts shaking, and sometimes there's a stick pusher. The actual stick moves forward. There's all kinds of buzzers and sounds and things going off. It's a lot. And if you haven't trained for that or been through it once, it seems like there's just too much to process in your brain simultaneously. So it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But if you're sitting at your desk and you got your cup of coffee and you're designing a lightning protection system for this electronic system, flight control system, you want the light to come on when it's not telling you the right thing. That's cool. But what other lights are going to come on simultaneously? And how do we handle that? That I think that's the big question right now, is like combinational errors like that crash in Russia. Yeah, it's all leading back to that same sort of thing.
Yeah, it's funny in the baseball world, because I have a background in baseball.
Yep.
They term that sped up, and that
Yeah.
happens when
Yeah.
you see a guy debut in the big leagues, and he's played that game his whole life, but now there's more fans, there's bright lights,
Yeah.
it's a very different environment, and
It
suddenly
is.
your mind is racing,
Yeah.
and you can't focus on any one thing very well, and you can't do the thing that you've been doing your whole life very
Yeah.
well. So it sounds
Yeah.
like that same thing in a cockpit.
Yeah.
You have to just
Yeah.
suddenly make all these decisions, and all
Yeah.
these different pieces of stimuli and feedback are suddenly, beeping at you, flashing at you. And
Yeah.
now you go, this was an unknown. Why is the plane doing this?
Yeah.
That seems like a lot of really important decisions to have to make in a short period of
Mhm.
time.
Yeah, and it's called, we call it flying by the seat of your pants, and that's in the sort of the pilot lingo of what happens. You get definitely sped up, right?
Hmm.
And if you do not have that sense of experience, you start to fly by the seat of your pants, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. You start to feel things like, how does the airplane feel? I can feel it accelerating, I can feel it decelerating, I can feel it going up, I can feel it go down. All those sensors are baloney. All right,
Yeah.
your brain is telling you wrong stuff, and it comes down to being able to sort through that and figure out the things that you need to focus on and dump on all the rest. That's a skill. And in sports and in piloting and driving a car and some of these Tesla accidents that have happened, it's a skill. It's a skill set, and you need to develop it. And it takes time to do it. And I think you're going to see a lot more in terms of training to do that. Thank goodness.
Yeah, it reminds me of the scene in Airplane, that classic movie, where I mean, there's
Yeah.
so many things you could reference at this moment, but
Yeah.
I just love when Leslie Nielsen, opens the door and says, "Just want to remind you, we're all counting on you." It's like,
Right.
thanks, thanks, needed
Yeah.
that. Thanks for the
Yeah.
old shot of pressure
Yeah.
added to all this. Yeah, that
Yeah. I
movie
just
is just
needed
a
that.
gem.
Yeah. It's just like that, right? I mean, if you're in any sort of new situation or in a new sort of environment, your brain isn't necessarily the right tool to get through it, especially especially relying on on some of your senses to tell you the truth. This may not be the right thing on an airplane, and that's one of
Yeah.
the early skills. Yeah.
Well, and that's why I think one of people, it's a really hot button issue where people are thinking about the future of self-driving cars. And
Yeah.
my buddy who's very
And
much on the
airplanes.
on the Tesla bandwagon, he's like,
Yep.
yeah, I'm going to be one of the first ones to get a self-driving car. And initially I
Yep.
was like, I don't know if I want to
Yeah.
put, I think a lot of people are like, I don't want to put my life in the hands of a machine. But then when you really start to
Yeah.
think about it, and how fast they can make very complex decisions
Yeah.
compared to someone who's easily distracted, who gets emotional, who's,
Yeah.
humans have a lot of other things that get in the way of a good decision. And then you think, oh yeah,
Right.
you know what? If this machine driving a car or an airplane has double, triple redundancy, it can process all of these complex things way faster than I can.
Yeah.
I'm probably safer putting my hands in it rather than my own decisions.
Yeah, I think there's 2, schools of thought on that right now. Uh, and I think you see it in 2 different companies. I think, Boeing has historically relied on pilots and pilot training to do things. Airbus has tended to take automation as the way to do it. And I'm not sure there's any particularly right answer there. I know Steve Wozniak with, Apple talks about, um, "There's no robot that can make me a cup of coffee. I can walk into my house and make me a cup of coffee." Yeah, that's right. It's a very some of the most simplistic things in the world that we do all the time as humans are very difficult to automate. And I kind of wonder if we're going to be in that similar situation with some of these newer aircraft designs as we go through, because there is a human element to it. There's a lot of functionality in a human being, which is not necessarily in a computer. So I kind of wonder how that's all going to work out, but we're going to find out. I think that's the thing. Over the next couple of years, we're going to find out because the Teslas of the world are not going away, and all the automated things are not going away. So it's going to be interesting to kind of watch this go down.